Hello and good evening, everyone. Welcome to our 46th Blue Health Virtual Seminar. Blue Health Virtual Seminar is a platform that allows health professionals to discuss current management updates of different health-related topics for better patient care. And this platform is brought to you by Blue Health Ethiopia, a medical consultancy company founded by medical doctors and a computer engineer. And we aim to be an influential healthcare leader in creating skilled communities through easily accessible knowledge in preventive medicine. And I'm your host, Dr. Abnet Ayalew, a general physician and first aid trainer from Blue Health Ethiopia. Today, it's a pleasure to have Dr. Abnet Ayalew here back with us again to give us a session on the topic, the death process and confirmation of death. You might remember Dr. Abnet from her previous session on medical error and negligence. And for those of you who don't know, Dr. Abnet Ayalew is an assistant professor of forensic medicine and toxicology at St. Paul Hospital.
All right, good evening, everyone. I thank Dr. Ayalew for the good introduction already. So I hope we've met with some of you on the previous sessions. Today's topic would be about death and its confirmation process. I believe this is a very important topic especially for clinicians. But unfortunately, in the undergraduate studies of our country and medical discipline, this is barely dealt with. But as clinicians, this I believe is a topic you encounter on daily basis. With the emerging awareness of the public and the judicial system to hold the physician accountable, the days where you guys would be held accountable for the legal implications of confirming of death would not be very far. So in a long term, I suggest if there are those of you who can put an impact in the curriculum and in the system, I suggest the introduction or the inclusion of the course of forensic medicine and toxicology in the undergraduate curriculums. But for those of you who have not had this course, this introduction in the undergraduate studies, since it's a topic that since it's a concept that you deal with every day, I think this discussion would be very important for you. So I prepared this discussion to put a light on the concept. And I thank Blue Health Ethiopia for the work they're doing in general, and also for giving me this stage to discuss a topic that's not commonly discussed, but I believe is important. So I would proceed to the seminar as of this minute. For participants, I would like to inform you the concept of death and the confirmation of death, its medical legal implications and all, is not something that you could grab in a moment. So this is just to put a highlight on the topic, and so that you could be inspired to dig more, to read more, and so that you could also understand that there are legal implications in the certification and confirmation of death that you could face in your daily clinical practices. Otherwise, the concept is a bit strange for us as clinicians, and it needs to be revised back and forth. As I've done forensic medicine residency for 3 years, and I've been practicing as a specialist physician in forensic medicine for almost 3 years. I still struggle with the concepts, and I still go back and forth. I read it repeatedly. So you guys also need to do that. So don't frustrate if you don't grab all the concepts in this seminar. This is just to put a highlight and to inspire you for further reading. So death is the most certain occurrence in life. And there's a field of medicine that studies death, meaning the process of death and the changes that come after that. And it's called thanatology, after the Greek thanatos and logos, which means death and science, respectively. Many scholars and many dictionaries have tried to define death, And here I've put some of the definitions. So Black's Law Dictionary has defined death as the cessation of life, the ceasing to exist, as defined by physicians as total stoppage of circulation of blood and cessation of the animal and vital functions consequent thereupon, such as respiration and pulsation. So more or less, most scholars have been defining death as irreversible or complete cessation of the respiratory and the cardiac functions thus far. But this definition has been challenged due to the emergence of the advanced resuscitation techniques that could continue the cardiopulmonary functions indefinitely, and also advanced life-sustaining equipment as the mechanical ventilator, which is also capable of maintaining blood pressure, circulation, and respiration in individuals. So when these conditions came to existence, the definitions that have defined death as permanent cessation of the cardiac and the respiratory functions have been greatly challenged. And updates have been constantly made, and the current most accepted definition, as proposed by the American Bar Association and the National Conference of Commissioners of Uniform State Laws, that was devised in 1980, has defined death an individual who has sustained either irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions or irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brain stem is dead. So this definition is most accepted now because it has the following features, and it has withstood the challenges which the previous, please move the slides, definitions have faced. So what is the added definitions to this? What is the added features to this most accepted definition? The first one is it's complete and elaborative. It entails both the circulatory, cardiac, and the respiratory arrest, and it also includes brain death. So it acknowledges the concept and utility of life-sustaining aid and equipments. So despite the use of life-sustaining equipments and utilities, where there is the permanent cessation of the brainstem, death could be defined. So the current definition is irreversible cessation of the cardiac and pulmonary system, or the irreversible and permanent cessation of the brain death, including the brain, including the brain. All stands from faculty to fit the definition to date. So anyway, why are we talking about death? Why is it important to define death and to know the moment of death? The first one is death has both legal and medical implications, and it's something that should be declared, reported, and registered. So declaration of death has importance because wrong declaration of death and shifting of the body for burial or cremation or at mortuary may land the doctor in trouble. So if you don't know when to declare death for sure, you could be responsible for premature diagnosis of death, and you could be disposing the body prematurely. You could be disposing someone who's not actually dead. You could be wrongfully diagnosing it as dead, and you could allow burials, you could allow cremations. And people could notice that the person has not been dead, and you could face consequences. The other one is if an event is declarable, it's also certifiable. So you have to know that death is a certifiable event. So the other thing is the moment of death is very important in organ transplantations, especially where organs are to be harvested or tissues are to be harvested from the dead body to be transplanted and to save lives. So most organs are dependent on the time of harvesting. So it's important that you know moment of death, because the earlier you diagnose death, you could be the more chances you have to salvage more organs that can be harvested and transplanted to other individuals to save life. The other one is presumption of death. We'll see this in the next slide. For death to exist, life has to exist. To define death, there should be a definition of life. So this is usually ambiguous in the newborn. So that is one of the other cases where definition of death is important for you guys to know. Also, insurance and inheritance issues. Since, depending on the moment of death, people could entail inheritance issues and could claim insurance. So the moment of death should be clear in such cases. So this is why you need to define death and moment of death. You should be very careful when you declare death for such instances. So presumption of survivorship and the presumption of death. This is usually in the legal conditions. This is about missing persons. Law of the country defines when to consider presumption of survivorship and when to consider presumption of death. Usually the law defines if it considers such concepts and if it considers the duration of years where these conditions can be considered. So these are usually legal considerations. So I'd be going through this concepts very briefly. So presumption of death or presumption of survivorship, it's usually assumed that a person is alive who has been alive within the past 30 years. And if there's nothing to suggest the probability of his death. So if someone has been missing, but he has been alive in the past 30 years, and there is nothing to suggest his death in the past 30 years, it's assumed that the person is still alive, even though he's missing and even though he's not available for the legal processes that engage him at the moment. So if another person who claims like inheritance has to prove that that person is dead, so I deserve inheritance or something, the burden of proof comes to that person, to whoever claims that the person is dead. So he has to prove beyond doubt that the person is dead. Otherwise, the law assumes if a person has been dead and there is nothing to suggest that the person could be dead. For example, if there has not been natural calamities like epidemics, like we've been having like Corona, which is fatal and claiming many lives, or floods or thunderstorms or man-made disasters as war, the assumption is that even though that person is not around, he is assumed that he's still alive. So if someone claims that he's dead, he's required to bring an evidence beyond reasonable doubt to prove the person in question is dead. So the question of presumption of survivorship may arise in connection in conditions that I discussed already, inheritance or distribution of properties, or when two or more persons, natural heirs of each other. So for example, if a father and a son go on sailing a ship, and if they didn't return to their home, then if one of the siblings of the son claims inheritance, it's assumed that the son who went with the father on the sailing of the ship has survived more days than the father because of first thing is age. Young people are assumed to live more than older people. So the inheritance is distributed first among the children, which includes the son who has gone on sailing with the father. And then the rest of the siblings share the remaining parts. So if that person has daughters and son of his own, so his share would be transferred to his daughters and sons. It's not assumed that a father and a son who have different ages would die immediately spontaneous at the same time. It's assumed the father dies first. So by the moment the father is dead first, all siblings, all children would inherit. And then when the son, when one of the siblings die, his share goes to his kids if he has kids. So this is a presumption of survivorship. This is usually considered in cases of courts and civil cases of inheritance and insurance case. So the process of death, one thing you have to learn from this seminar is death is a process. It's not instantaneous. As we usually assume in our clinical practice, we think it's something that happens instantly, but it is not. So it's the end of the dying process. A person dies in a process. There are, of course, exceptions where death is instantaneous, where the processes of dying happen all at once. This could be bomb blasts, nuclear injury, fragmentations of the body, crushing of the brain in vehicular accidents. Except in this very few exceptions, death usually occurs in process. So tripods of life, these are the systems in our body that maintain health and wellness. So these are the brain, the respiratory system, and the cardiac system. These are the three systems, vital systems, that are important for existence and health. So what does it mean? If one of these systems are affected, there is a danger for the person to go into death. So these are known as tripods of life, as well as door of death. In reverse order, what it means is if one of the systems are affected in an irreversible and permanent fashion, it's imminent that the other systems would eventually fail and death will occur. So these three systems are interlinked and important for the person to stay alive and in health, and also to start the process of death. For this reason, these three systems, the brain, the respiratory system, and the cardiac system, are known as tripods of life and door of death. So there are other systems in our life, in our body, but the other systems, except these three systems, are not as vital for the existence of a person or for the initiation of the process of death. So these are tripods of life and door of death. So eventually, for a person to go into the process of death, one of the systems have to permanently and irreversibly fail, and the other of these two systems have to follow. That's when you call someone dead. All right, so as we've said, death is a process. It occurs in phases. So there are two types of death or phases of death. The first one is somatic death. Soma means body. So this is systemic death or clinical death. And the other one is molecular death. It happens at a molecular or cellular level. So somatic death, also called clinical death, because this is what happens in somatic death. Signs in somatic death are what the clinician diagnoses as death. This is what you're looking for, evidences of somatic death when you confirm death in your daily practices. And this is also where the legal system recognizes as death. This is the moment you can fill death certificates. This is the moment you can declare death, the body dead. So somatic death is the existence, the cessation of the existence or demise of the body, in short. So this is characterized by complete loss of sensibility and the ability to move. There is also complete and irreversible cessation of the functions of the tripods of life. So loss of sensibility and ability to move would go to the nervous system or the brain. Complete and irreversible cessation of the other systems of the heart and lung. So for the somatic death to occur, the nervous system, including the brain and brainstem, the heart and the lung systems have to fail. But by this moment, it doesn't mean individual cells have ceased to exist, and respiration and metabolism in individual cells may not have stopped. So this is evidenced by the response individual cells show to chemical, thermal, or electrical stimuli. For example, pupils may contract on application of a myotic drug. The person is dead. The three systems have failed irreversibly and completely, but still some cells may not have ceased to exist. So pupils may contract, other muscles may also respond to electrical stimuli. You could see contraction of muscles, contraction of the pupil, and others also. For different stimuli, the individual cells may continue to respond. So this is the legal definition of death, is somatic definition of death. So molecular death is also called a cellular death. This is the moment where individual cells in the body discontinue to exist. This is where we declare the person has completely ceased to exist at cellular level. Individual cells have stopped their aerobic or anaerobic metabolisms. Molecular date goes to late signs of death, we'll see later, and molecular date, signs of molecular death are surest indicators of death. So where are we giving a lot of emphasis to somatic death, which is not the surest sign of death, while there is molecular death, which is the surest indicators of death, because molecular death happens quite later, hours or maybe a day later. Signs of molecular death happen quite later. So as clinicians, we don't have that long. We're supposed to declare death in minutes, in seconds, or maximum in hours. So we give a lot of emphasis to somatic death, whereas the surest indicator of death is signs of molecular death. So why do we have this process of somatic death occurring first and then molecular death? Why is molecular death taking hours? Because molecular death depends on the individual metabolic activity and need of oxygen of the individual tissues. So those that require less oxygen would continue to exist on anaerobic metabolisms and with less available oxygen, while those that depend on high circulation and those that have high metabolic activity would come to death in a few seconds of oxygen deprivation. So of this, brain cells, the cortical cells, are the most sensitive to oxygen deprivation. This is more like carbon dioxide is the most strong drive for brain cells to fight for their lives. It's not directly that they are sensitive to oxygen. They're more sensitive to accumulation of carbon dioxide. However, they're indirectly sensitive to oxygen deprivation, and they are the most sensitive cells in the body. So this means with the deprivation of the oxygen for the brain cells of 4 to 6 minutes duration could result in potentially irreversible damage to the brain cortex. This is true to the cortex only. So, as I said earlier, molecular death occurs in piecemeal. So cells like the white blood cells, they could exist up to 12 hours. And for muscle cells to die, it takes about 1 to 2 hours. So depending on their oxygen demand, cells die, individual cells die in different paces. So as a general rule, organs that receive or need more blood supply during life will die early. So this has a very critical importance for removal of organs. So if we are having cadaveric donations, if we are removing organs from the dead body, the first thing is we have to diagnose it as early as possible, while taking cautions not to declare death prematurely. But in the meantime, we have to know which organs are sensitive to deprivation of oxygen and which die early. So those organs should be removed from the cadaver very early and be transferred to preservative medias. What's the significance of knowing that death occurs in steps in process, that death is a process, and what can we do with the gap between the somatic death and the molecular death? So what's the significance of determining or knowing that death occurs in process, and what can we do for the gap between somatic death and molecular death? So somatic death is clinical death. It's what you clinicians diagnose as the person as dead. So it depends, diagnosing somatic death depends on earliest signs of death, which may not be surest indicators of death. So there is a possibility of wrongful declaration of death. So if you have to wait, you need to wait. If you're not sure, you need to wait. If you cannot depend on the somatic indicators of death, if you need to wait, you should wait if you're not very sure. Or you can also you can call for your friends, you can call for help to help you diagnose death with multiple professionals, or you can use multiple criteria. So somatic death is the stage that you diagnose as. The other thing is there are multiple conditions that mimic somatic death. So you will discuss this later, but you also have to take care when diagnosing somatic death prematurely. The third one is disposal of the body. In rare instances, as there is a possibility for you guys to diagnose somatic death prematurely in the person that is not dead, there is also a possibility that you might have diagnosed the somatic death, that you have diagnosed the occurrence of irreversible and complete cessation of the three systems, the tripods of life or doors of death. But since somatic death and molecular death do not happen at the same time, relatives or family may notice that some tissues and organs are still responsive to different stimuli, for lights, for chemicals, or for electric stimuli. So this could create tension, and you may not feel like you've been trusted by the family. The family may think like you have diagnosed death before it happened. So if you have the knowledge that a person could die, but tissues could continue to respond, different tissues could continue to respond to different stimuli, you can easily describe this to families and de-escalate the tension and untrustworthiness. So the most important thing is what we can do between the gap, in the gap between somatic and molecular death. This is very important for transplantation purposes. The gap between somatic death and molecular death is the ideal time to harvest organs that you could potentially use for transplantations. So this is a very critical period. In our country, transplantation from cadaveric donation is not yet approved. We don't have the technology and we don't have the legal permissions yet, but I don't think it would be very far until those technologies are adopted and the law also starts to permit that. So it's very important when to to know when to harvest organs for transplantations. It's also important to know which organs to harvest first in minutes of occurrence of somatic death and which organs can wait. For example, the cornea can be harvested even after 24 hours of occurrence of death in the stage of molecular death. Even in decomposed bodies, the cornea could still be viable for harvesting and transplantation. Whereas if you don't harvest the kidneys, the lungs, the brain, the heart, and the liver in minutes with a maximum of an hour of occurrence of the somatic date, if you take too long and if the body has already entered the stage of molecular death or late signs of death, late stages of death, you may miss these organs that could potentially save lives. So this is very important in the retrieval of organs for transplantations. So there is this document, Transplantation of Human Organs Act. It was formulated in 1994. It puts a lot of concepts into clearance. When you can harvest, when to call a person a donor. So different countries adopt different versions of this act, but it's important for you to know that Transplantation of Human Organs Act exists, and it was established in 1994. With this, we come to the concepts of brain death and brainstem death. We frequently hear a person as brain dead. We frequently hear as a person as brain dead, but we don't hear frequently as brainstem death. I don't think many clinicians, many of us, myself included in my clinical years, we're not very comfortable with brain death, the concept of brain death. So I'll try to discuss it briefly. And I suggest you guys take more interest to read into it. It's a very interesting concept. So some scholars define brain death as the death of cortical part of the brain only. And others define brain death as cortical death, brainstem death, and death of the whole brain. So either way, what is the burning issue here? What is the concept of cortical brain death, and what's the concept of brainstem death? So the concept of brainstem death, and why are we discussing it in special attention? So brain, for a person to exist, or any animal to exist, the cortex of the brain is for higher cerebral activities as thinking, awareness, consciousness, and conscious drives of the respiratory and the cardiac systems. Otherwise, the cortex of the brain is not essential for the existence of the person. The existence of the person depends on the brainstem. So a person could be brain dead, the cortex of the brain could be dead, but the person could still continue to exist. So this means cortical brain death may not necessarily equate to the death of a person. In this condition, clinically, patient is in potentially irreversible but deep coma, and coma is usually potentially irreversible. It's not all the time irreversible. We have cases where people have regained their consciousness after 30 years, after 39 years. The longest is, I think, for after 39 years. So in case of cortical brain death, it's potentially irreversible, but it's not diagnosed as irreversible. It's potentially irreversible, but the coma has to be deep coma, and it shows signs of severe brain dysfunction with loss of higher levels of cerebral activity. And cortical brain death usually results from hypoxic insult, traumatic insult, or toxic insult. So in this condition, the person is in a vegetative state. He can never interact with the environment. He's not responsive to stimuli. He cannot take care of himself, but he's not dead. So this is why it's a living cadaver. They're not pronounced dead. They're not considered dead because they don't fulfill the criteria. Since the brainstem is intact, with the support of systems, they can still go on breathing and with the circulation going on. So they don't fulfill the criteria for somatic death, but they're not considered, so they're called living cadavers. So here is where, especially the forensic pathologist, the neurologist, emergency and intensive care unit specialists are quite in dilemma for the determination for the cessation of life support. So it's usually an interaction of multiple theories and what's best for the patient, what's best for the attendants, and all. We have to consider all those things. Otherwise, it's not easy to discontinue life support in this case. Since the brainstem is intact, the circulation and the respiratory system can go on, and families may not be happy that the supports could be disconnected and the person be declared dead. So they could argue that the person is not dead yet, so they want them to go on. So it's not easy. The decision is not easy to discontinue life supports. So diagnosis of cortical brain death only where the cortex is dead, where the cortex of the brain is dead, is currently done with the widely accepted Harvard criteria. So these are the three criteria. I'm sorry, unresponsive and unreceptive to environmental and internal stimuli, no movements or spontaneous breathing, and no reflexes. No reflexes goes for cranial nerves in the cortical distribution. Otherwise, reflexes of the cranial nerves in the brainstem are still intact. So for the cortical and spinal reflexes are absent, and cortical cranial nerve distribution reflexes are absent. So that's what it means by no reflexes. If you have a doubt in the diagnosis of cortical brain death, and if you have the access, you could do EEG, electroencephalogram. And since it's an objective test, it's a criteria that substantiates the strength of diagnosis of cortical brain death. There's also the Minnesota criteria for the diagnosis of brain death. So I'd suggest you go through it. However, the Harvard criteria is the most accepted one. And the additional criteria of EEG, flat EEG for the duration is ambiguous. However, flat EEG for 30 seconds is the accepted, no, for 1 minute is accepted. Some scholars suggest up to 5 minutes, and some scholars suggest a person cannot go without a brain activity for 5 minutes and be alive in the cortex. So 1 to 5 minutes is the accepted. Minimum is 1 minute anyway. So the next concept is brainstem death. Brainstem death is very critical. I suggest you guys be comfortable with it and also avoid rushed diagnosis of brainstem death. So why is the brainstem in a very highlighted concept currently as the definition of death? Practically, if you can diagnose brainstem death, you can diagnose somatic death and you can declare the person dead. So because it contains the vital centers that control respiration and cardiac activity, and also ascending reticular pathways that awakens the person. I'm sorry, the brainstem death is considered as the death of a person. This is the moment you can comfortably diagnose somatic death. This is the moment you can diagnose and certify death. So diagnosis of brainstem death is based on brainstem death determination. We'll see the criteria below. So the document of Transplantation of Human Organs Act defines brainstem death as the stage at which all functions of the brainstem have permanently and irreversibly ceased, and is so certified. If you can diagnose brainstem death, you can diagnose death of the person and certify it. So what is the significance in the medical and legal disciplines of the brainstem death? As I said, this is the clinically certified stage of death. It's equivalent to somatic death. So whatever we said about the somatic death as a medical legal significance, it also entails for the diagnosis of brainstem death. Time of death is counted from the diagnosis of brainstem death in criminal and civil courts. So again, the very important question for clinicians, if you diagnose brainstem death, if you're sure, if you are certain the diagnosis of brainstem death, you can comfortably wean a person from artificial life supports. So I'm sorry for the interruptions with my coughing. I've not been well lately. So who determines brainstem death? It's a very careful diagnosis. So the document of Transplantation of Human Organs Act recommends the determination of the brainstem death by a board of doctors that consists the following. So you could see that there are 4 types of doctors, and brainstem be diagnosed by a couple of people. So this is to avoid a rushed diagnosis of brainstem death. And hence, a neurologist or a neurosurgeon, it's not easy. It's not like a black and white diagnosis. So that's why it has a lot of criteria. That's why it is recommended to be done by a board of doctors that consists of 4 doctors at least. So the precaution here is whoever has a doctor who has an interest in the transplantation of the harvesting of organs and transplantation of organs to another patient should not be in the board. Also, in case where their opinions in the diagnosis of brainstem death falls into 2 categories, and it's a draw. If 2 of the doctors say the person is not dead in the brainstem, and 2 of them say the person is dead at the brainstem. So wherever the neurologist or the neurosurgeon falls, the opinion of the neurosurgeon or the neurologist falls, that group would win. If the neurologist says the person is not dead, so that opinion holds and all resuscitations are continued. If the group that the neurologist falls in is of the opinion that the person is dead, so death could be declared. So what are the precautions that we should take in diagnosis of brainstem death? Irreversible brain damage, brainstem damage should be established. We should make sure that the damage to the brainstem is irreversible. The cause is irreversible. By this, what does it mean? We should rule out as much as possible all causes of reversible comas. So the common causes that we should rule out are intoxication, depressant drugs, like barbiturates, muscle relaxants, anesthesias, primary hypothermia, hypovolemic shock, metabolic or endocrinal disturbances. So all these conditions could mimic somatic and brainstem death. So we should make sure that these conditions are not the ones that we're putting as a cause of irreversible brainstem damage. It should be ruled out. Irreversible brainstem damage should be ruled in, and reversible cause of coma should be ruled out. So as I said, it should not be rushed, and the person, if there's a dilemma, at least should be on mechanical aids, life support aids, and should be diagnosed, should be evaluated at least twice with a reasonable of time gap for about 6 hours or so. And as I have said, in the board of doctors, the participation of a doctor who has an interest in the harvesting and transplantation of an organ should not be present. So how do we assess brainstem? It should be assessed from the function. Structural and functional damage of the brainstem should be assessed from the cranial nerves in the distribution of the midbrain and brainstem. So these are the following reflexes should be absent, and they should be evaluated at least twice by a board of doctors, and they should be declared absent. So these are the reflexes: dilated fixed pupils, not responding to sharp changes in intensity of incident light. As I have said, pupils could continue to respond to other stimuli, thermal or chemical stimuli, but the light stimulus, the light response is the most dependable. Absence of motor responses within the cranial nerve distribution of painful stimulation. Corneal reflexes should be absent. Vestibular or ocular reflexes should be absent. And this should be done as you do on the alive person. It's different when you suspect the person has been dead for a couple of hours. So it should be considered that the person is still alive, and the determination of these reflexes should be done as you do in your clinical cases. And absence of spontaneous breathing is the last one. So this is the concept of cortical brain death and brainstem death discussed in brief. So we proceed to signs of death. When do we say a person is dead? So why do we have to know signs of death? Signs of death are indicators of somatic death or molecular death or instantaneous death. Signs of death are the changes the body undergoes after the occurrence of death. So we have to know the signs that a person shows when he is dead. So these are also the signs that you're looking for when you're confirming death. So these changes are useful in determining the time since death, since the occurrence of death. But this is usually useful for the death investigators and for the judicial system. So for you guys, you don't really need to know the determination of time since death, but it's the same science that the forensic pathologist or the judicial system uses to determine time since the occurrence of death. So these changes are grossly grossly classified into immediate, early, and late signs. Immediate signs are those that occur within few seconds to few minutes of death. So these are indicators of this correspond with somatic or clinical death. So these are the signs. Immediate signs after death or immediate changes after death are those that you look for in confirming somatic death or brainstem death or clinical death. So early signs follow, early signs after death or early changes after death follow within about 12 to 24 hours. And this contain mixed molecular or cellular death or at times somatic death. Late signs follow after 24 hours and they represent molecular death. So while immediate and few early signs are relevant to the clinician in the confirmation of death, unfortunately, these signs are only probable signs to the confirmation of death. Why are they probable? Because there are a lot of mimicry conditions. There are a lot of differentials to the occurrence of these signs, and these signs correspond to the occurrence of somatic death. So this is why in confirming death clinically, the clinician is advised to involve more doctors in case of ambiguities and to use many signs and many criteria in combination. Late signs, however, they occur after 24 hours, but they are the surest indicators of death. unfortunately, we mostly don't have that long in the diagnosis of, in the confirmation of death. So that's why we have to depend on the immediate and early signs. So these are the immediate changes after death, the early changes after death, and the late changes after death. Late changes are decomposition or modifications of decomposition as adipose hair formation and mummification. So these are imminent signs, and these are not discussed. Since for you guys, for mostly here, I presume are clinicians, and you don't usually deal with a person who has, you don't usually get a person who has been dead for more than 24 hours for confirmation. I think your question would be for the few minutes and hours after the occurrence of death. So immediate changes after death are stoppage of function of nervous system, sensibility and awareness, stoppage of respiration, and stoppage of circulation. Early changes in the eye, changes in skin, cooling of the body, postmortem lividity, rigor mortis, and changes in body fluids. So we discussed those parameters that cause difficulties that you would use in diagnosis of confirmation of death, and that cause difficulties in the process. So immediate signs relevant to the clinician in the diagnosis of confirmation of death: insensibility and loss of voluntary power. Of course, as the person dies, he becomes insensible with the loss of sensory and motor functions. This happens in the immediately after, in the few seconds and minutes. And there's loss of reflexes and muscles become flaccid. The pupils are widely fixed and dilated and not reacting to light. So what is the, but these are also conditions, these conditions, insensibility and loss of voluntary powers, you could find them in different conditions other than death. So just because you have this insensibility and loss of voluntary power, if you rush to diagnose death, you could be accused of withdrawal of resuscitative efforts, and you should not depend on this only. So if you have dilemmas, you could use diagnosis of brainstem. This is the recommended step, and or the whole brain death as suggested above. The other one is stoppage of respiration. With somatic death, of course, there is entire and permanent cessation of respiration. So how do you diagnose cessation of respiration? With inspection, palpation, and auscultation. So thus far, there has also been cases where people have tried to diagnose the permanent and irreversible cessation of respiration, but now the tests are usually obsolete and they only have historical significance. People have tried to pose glass mirrors in front of the nostrils of the individual in question and have tried to notice the steaming up of the mirror. And if there is no steaming, the person was declared dead. There's also the feather test. If the feather moves as it is placed in front of the nostril and all. So, however, these tests have become obsolete and they have mainly historical significance. The time-honored procedure is prolonged listening with the stethoscope over the trachea or lung fields. Where you could have mimicry conditions is emphysema and silent chest of asthma. So where you cannot diagnose permanent stoppage of respiratory system, use combination of tests. See the cessation of the nervous system, see cessation of the circulatory system as well. Stoppage of circulatory system. This is also something that ceases as the person goes into somatic death. This is one of the earliest signs. So, but however, there are differentials to these diagnostic methods. So what can you do? You can do palpation of the peripheral pulses, radial, brachial, femoral, and carotid pulsations for the touch and auscultation also. Or the whole pericardial area is to be consulted, to be auscultated for the presence or absence of heart sounds. Auscultation should be done for at least 1 minute and repeated at short intervals if necessary. If you still have doubts, you could do the auscultation for heart sounds for 5 to 10 minutes. And in the usual clinical practice, absence of auscultatory heart sounds for 5 to 10 minutes is acceptable evidence of death in the usual, where there are no further ambiguities. However, there could be conditions where the person could be alive, the circulation has not stopped, but where you could fail to listen to the heart sounds. These are the conditions where there is thick chest wall, where there is emphysema and all. So if you have doubts beyond the proof of the cessation of the nervous system and the respiratory system, you could also add ECGs. And a flat ECG for a continuous period of 5 to 10 minutes is accepted as an evidence of death. There are also tests to certify the permanent cessation of the circulatory system. However, these are also obsolete in clinical practice and have only historical significance. So in the immediate period, resuscitations should not be withdrawn immediately, and they should be standard resuscitation efforts should be continued, and only after 10 to 50 minutes of standard resuscitations, reliably, if the spontaneous resumption of the cardiorespiratory system could not occur, you can reliably diagnose somatic death. Some protocols request resuscitation, especially in the US, and in some incidences as drowning deaths. Some protocols request that resuscitations go on until early signs of death as rigor mortis or livor mortis become apparent. So depending on the protocol, that's when you could withdraw resuscitations. However, for clinical case purposes, do up to 10 to 50 minutes of resuscitation. And if the cardiorespiratory system could not resume spontaneously, then you can withdraw resuscitative efforts and diagnose death. So early signs of death, and these are facial pallor, cooling of the body, livor mortis, and changes in the eye. So these are not to be used independently in the diagnosis of early immediate signs. This could be used as an additional one. So facial pallor is the paleness of the face. It has also multiple factors, and it's not universal for all deaths. Cooling of the body, this also depends on the environment, on the cause of death and all. However, if you could measure rectal temperature, and if you measure rectal temperature of 21 degrees centigrade, you also need chemical mercury thermometer for this. So, however, this also happens. Cooling starts after the body has lost its temperature and loss of temperature gradient has been established. So it takes many hours. However, if you could diagnose rectal temperature of less than 21 degrees centigrade, you can reliably diagnose death. Livor mortis and rigor mortis. These are also believed to be good indicators. Livor mortis is sedimentation of the blood on the dependent areas. This is believed to occur because of the loss of circulatory forces that keeps the blood circulating. So gravity dominates and pulls the blood to dependent areas. So this usually occurs in dead people, but it also has occurred in alive people, and it's not just a good indicator of death. However, it's not exclusively an exclusive indicator. The same goes for rigor mortis, but it still could occur in the alive people. Change in the eye, good indicators of death in the eye maybe for the clinician. Loss of corneal reflex, we've said this in the diagnosis of brainstem death. Flaccidity of the eyeball, so the eyeball pressure significantly falls, and in the alive it's estimated to be 14 to 25 gram. But when the heart ceases to beat, the tension would fall to about half and fell as low as it's after about half an hour. What you could do clinically is to palpate the eyeball with the closed eye, with the closed eyelid. You can palpate the eyeball and try to pull the eyeball to the sides. And if it comes easily distorted, then tension has been lost, and this could be a good indicator of death in the clinical setup. So we have discussed the state of the pupils. People usually become unreactive to light in the occurrence of brainstem death. That is an early sign. However, they could continue to respond to other stimuli. The reliable and a phenomena that's gaining attention is tracking of phenomena, the tracking phenomena in the vessels of the retina. This occurs everywhere in the vessels of the body. However, the retina is an accessible part. So you could do ophthalmic examination and you could see segmentation of the capillary blood. Like a cattle in a line, you could see tracking or cattle tracking phenomena, and currently this is being used as a good indicator of death. This has not occurred in the alive thus far, so this is a reliable one, but it takes hours to occur. So if you have that long, it can only be used reliably then. Late changes after death are decomposition and modifications of decomposition. These are reliable indicators. The only thing is you don't have this long. They occur after 24 hours. So what are the conditions that mimic somatic death, that also known as apparent death? What are the conditions that you should rule out before diagnosing death? ማለት ነው. So this is also known as apparent death and suspended animation. This is a condition where state of the body in which the vital functions are at a very low or minimal level, that the body functions cannot be determined by ordinary methods of clinical examination. So what does this mean? When we see people with apparent death or suspended animation, we could easily be fooled to diagnose or to declare them as dead. And the usual mechanisms that we use to determine the cessation of the three vital functions would tell us that the functions have stopped. But if we know the history, and if we have the information that this could be apparent deaths, what we should do is we should do vigorous resuscitative attempts and be very cautious before declaring death in such instances. So these people, the circulation, respiration, and the nervous system functions, they have not stopped. They're just not clinically detectable because they are maintained at minimum state compatible with life. Almost always prompt resuscitation revives the condition of apparent death. So if you have a person declared or assumed to be dead and brought to you by the conditions that could potentially cause apparent death, you should really take caution. You should go into vigorous resuscitative attempts, because almost always these cases are revivable. So these are types of apparent death or suspended animation. It could be voluntary. People could maintain their metabolic demands and functions in a very minimum level that is compatible to life. The yogis are known to do this. It's something that they do. It's not something you do right away. It's something you do through practice. So this is very practicable, and it would be very difficult for you to diagnose in a minute. So if you have a yogi and people bring him to you or her to you, you should be careful before declaring death. What you should do is go into resuscitative attempts. The other one is involuntary, where people suddenly fall into suspended animations. They are not dead, but they fall into this minimum. The body minimizes its demands to minimum level so that it could survive. For example, in hypothermia, in extreme cold weather, or in extreme hot weather, metabolic demands would come to very low levels so that the person can use whatever is left in his body to survive. So these are the cases where involuntary apparent deaths occur. So these are the cases where the causes of apparent death, as we said, in yogis and trances, in cataplexy, in extreme excitation that leads to the suspension of a person due to high emotional state, that is known as cataplexy, in hysteria, sunstrokes, and concussion, in brain injuries, in drowning. You should be very careful before you declare dead in people revived from the water. Also hypothermia, if you have less than body temperature, especially of the intranasal or intraoral measures of less than 32 degrees centigrade, I suggest you don't rush to declaration of death. You go to vigorous resuscitative attempts. Also in electrocutions, narcotic poisonings, and anesthesias. So why do you have to know about apparent death? Almost all cases are reversible with vigorous resuscitations. Hence, you could be responsible for premature withdrawal of resuscitation. You could be diagnosing a person whom you could have resuscitated and revived prematurely dead. So for a wrongful diagnosis of death and certification, you might go into certification, writing a certificate and reporting the death. And you could also be responsible for premature disposal of body, resulting in alive burials. There has been cases where a person has been revived from, it's a woman of 38 years. It's in the books, forensic pathology books. She was revived from a water well, and she continued in that state for about 8 hours. And two doctors were called, and they both said that she was dead. And she was transferred to the morgue. And in the morgue technician noticed flickering of the eyelid and tearing of one of her eyes. So he reported that, and then she was transferred to emergency unit. Warming up of the body along with other resuscitation were done, and she was revived. So be careful before. So this could be as well diagnosed where a person has been taken to the grave, where a person has been taken to the the cremation box or something. So be very careful before diagnosing cases in such causes, because it could be apparent death. So that would be all. I'll take a few of your questions if you have them. I think we have time. Question and answer.
In the Q&A section.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I couldn't see that. Okay, we don't have many of them. So how to report the cause of death, especially in those with sudden death. Okay, this is one of the reporting cause of death. This is one of the topics that we'll discuss when we do certification of medical certification of death. We'll see what are the causes of death, which ones to put in the medical certificate on, and all. So what do we mean also by cause of death? Intermediate, immediate, and all we'll discuss when we do those things. Now we only are doing diagnosis of death. Cause of death and diagnosis of death are different. So I hope to see you, Hamid Abdul Hakim. I thank you for the question. Please join us on the death certification session. We hope to have it soon. Okay, brain cells end up with death in 4 to 6 minutes of stoppage of circulation, but also mentioned as it is possible to harvest the brain up to 1 hour of death. How is that possible? No, brain cells, if the death, if the system that fails early, the earliest system, if it's the brain, if it's the whole, the death starts from the brain, we don't have the opportunity. If death starts from the other system, the cardiac and the respiratory systems, we may have the opportunity to harvest brain cells. But if it's from the brain that the death has started, the atria, the door has been the failure of the brain, the organ of the brain, then it's not possible to harvest brain cells in this case. All right. Our country slow from brain dead patient care. To my knowledge, there is no adaptation of the Transplantation Human Organ Act in our country. It's not adopted to my knowledge. And brain dead patient care, maybe it could be defined for emergency and intensive care units or anesthesia departments. But as to the forensic department, we don't have a protocol for the brain dead patient. And it's not an easy concept. Also, it's not black and white. In the management is not black and white. Of course, you continue on supportive measures, but the cessation of life support has always been ambiguous globally, as I have discussed there. If there's a protocol regarding the care of the brain dead patient, I'm not aware of it. Okay, how do we define death on arrival? All right, so death on arrival, this also needs to define, goes to the concept of when do we call hospital death, when do we call death on arrival? So the criteria is the same. The criteria we use for death on arrival or hospital death or whatever is the same. The only thing is, when do we call it death on arrival? The time duration. So this is also different from sudden death. We'll see in the next discussion. But however, death on arrival is, we use the same criteria. It's just the timing. So some hospitals use 30 minutes occurrence of death at arrival or within 30 minutes of stay. Some protocols define as 2 hours. Some protocols define as 20 hours, 2 to 20 hours. Now, even 24 hours, less than 20 hospital stays of less than 24 hours are being defined as death on arrival. So diagnosis of death depends, stays the same. It's only the duration. When do you call it death on arrival is only the different concept here. So you don't have different diagnosis criteria for death on arrival. And the duration is different. Some call it within minutes, up to 30 minutes, 2 hours, and 20 hours. Now, even up to 24 hours, they're being defined as death on arrival. So I think that's all. What is yogis? Yogis are those that practice yoga. Yoga practice የሚያደርጉት ሰዎች. So in a form of fasting and maintaining the needs of the body to minimal, they practice this state of suspended animation or apparent death. They eat minimally, they breathe minimally, and with that, they go into the state of voluntary suspended animation. So yogis are those that practice yoga.
Yeah, thank you very much, Doctor.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Doctor, for taking the time to present well-being sync. Again, thank you very much, and we hope to see you soon in the next session. And for those,
I hope to see you there too. So thank you all for your time, for listening to me, and for you guys to give me the stage to discuss the topic of my interest.
Thank you very much, Doctor.